The fluorescent lights in Riverside Prep's cafeteria buzzed with that particular frequency that promised a headache by shift's end. Carmen DeLuca wiped down the stainless steel counter for the third time that hour, her rubber gloves squeaking against the metal as she worked circles around a stubborn grease stain that refused to budge. 10:30 in the morning meant preparation time, the calm before the storm of hungry teenagers descended like locusts at noon. She moved between the industrial ovens and the serving line with practiced efficiency, checking temperatures, stirring pasta sauce that bubbled in enormous pots, arranging plastic-wrapped sandwiches in neat rows that would be destroyed within minutes of the lunch bell. This was her life now. Not the career she'd imagined at 29, but the reality she'd accepted after her small bakery in Little Italy had gone under 8 months ago. Turns out artisanal bread and handcrafted pastries couldn't compete with rising rents and corporate coffee chains. The bankruptcy had been quick and brutal, taking with it not just her business but the savings she'd scraped together over 5 years, the dream she'd built from her nana's recipes and her own stubborn determination. So now she served reheated lasagna to privileged kids whose parents paid more for one semester at Riverside Prep than Carmen had earned in a year at her bakery. The irony wasn't lost on her. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The school itself occupied a converted mansion in one of Chicago's wealthiest suburbs, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers that seemed wildly inappropriate for teenage boys who tracked mud and spilled energy drinks with equal enthusiasm. Riverside catered exclusively to boys from 7th through 12th grade, sons of politicians and CEOs and, if the whispered rumors were true, several men whose wealth came from less legitimate sources. Carmen had learned quickly not to ask questions. The pay was decent, the benefits better than anything she'd had as a small business owner, and the work was mindless enough that she could lose herself in the rhythm of serving and cleaning without thinking too hard about everything she'd lost. She was pulling a tray of garlic bread from the oven when she heard the commotion. Shouting first, male voices raised in alarm, then a crash that sounded like furniture being thrown. Carmen set down the tray and moved toward the cafeteria's entrance, where a small crowd of teachers and administrative staff had gathered, blocking her view of whatever chaos was unfolding in the hallway beyond. "Someone get Mr. Patterson," a teacher shouted, "and call security." "I already tried. He's not answering his phone." "Then try his father. We need someone here now before he hurts someone." Carmen pushed through the crowd, curiosity overriding her usual policy of staying invisible and uninvolved. What she saw made her stop cold. A boy stood in the center of the marble hallway, maybe 15 or 16, with the kind of lean build that suggested he'd grown tall fast and hadn't quite filled out yet. His school uniform, white shirt, navy tie, khaki pants, was disheveled, the tie hanging loose around his neck, shirt untucked. His dark hair fell across his forehead in messy waves, and his face was flushed with rage. But it wasn't his appearance that made everyone keep their distance. It was the desk he'd somehow dragged from a nearby classroom and overturned, sending papers and textbooks cascading across the polished floor. It was the chair he currently held above his head like a weapon, his arms shaking with the effort of keeping it raised. It was the absolutely feral look in his dark eyes, the kind of rage that went beyond normal teenage rebellion into something far more dangerous. "Stay back!" the boy shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "All of you just stay the hell away from me." Nico. A male teacher Carmen recognized as Mr. Patterson, the dean of students, approached with his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Put the chair down. Whatever happened, we can talk about it." "I don't want to talk." Nico swung the chair in a wide arc, making Patterson stumble backward. "I want everyone to leave me alone." "Son, you need to calm down." Patterson tried again, his voice strained. "You're going to hurt someone." "Good. Maybe then people will actually listen when I say leave me alone." He threw the chair, not at anyone specifically, but toward the wall where it hit with a crack that echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. Several younger students who'd been watching from a safe distance scattered, and Carmen heard at least one girl crying. "That's it. I'm calling the police," Patterson muttered, pulling out his phone. "No." Another teacher grabbed his arm. "You know we can't do that. His father will—" "I don't care who his father is. The boy is out of control, and it's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt." Carmen watched Nico grab another chair, his breathing ragged, his movements becoming more erratic. She'd seen this before, not in a school hallway, but in her own mirror during the months after her bakery closed. That particular flavor of rage that came from feeling cornered, from having no control over your own life, from wanting to break things just to prove you still had the power to affect something, anything in a world that was crushing you. This wasn't just teenage acting out. This was someone drowning. The boy raised the chair, and this time his aim was definitely toward the clustered teachers. Patterson tried to rush forward, but Nico was faster, younger, and fueled by whatever demons were driving him. Carmen moved without thinking. She stepped out from behind the protective cluster of adults, walking directly into Nico's line of sight. She held no weapons, made no threatening moves, just walked calmly across the debris-strewn hallway until she was maybe 10 feet from him. "Miss DeLuca, get back," Patterson hissed, but she ignored him. Nico's attention snapped to her, the chair still raised above his head. Up close, she could see the tears mixing with the rage on his face, could see how young he really was beneath all that fury. 16 at most. A child, really, despite his height and the violence radiating from him. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice rough. "Nobody important," Carmen replied quietly. "Just the lunch lady." "Then get out of my way before I hurt you." "You're not going to hurt me." "How do you know?" The challenge in his voice was desperate, almost pleading. Like he wanted her to be afraid, wanted someone to finally treat him like the danger he was trying so hard to embody. "Because you're not actually angry at me. Or them." Carmen gestured toward the teachers. "You're angry at something else entirely, and breaking furniture isn't going to fix it." "You don't know anything about me." But his arms were lowering slightly, the chair no longer quite so ready to be thrown. "You're right. I don't." Carmen took another step closer, and she heard Patterson make a sound of protest behind her. "But I know what it feels like when everything's wrong and you can't fix it, and the only thing that makes sense is destroying something." Nico's jaw clenched. "Yeah? And what do you know about that?" Carmen thought about her bakery, about watching the bank take the keys, about boxing up her nonna's recipes and her custom ovens and everything she'd built, about the particular humiliation of serving institutional food to rich kids when she'd once created art with flour and butter and love. "Enough," she said simply. They stared at each other across the damaged hallway. The chair in Nico's hands wavered, his arms trembling with exhaustion and emotion. Carmen could see him fighting with himself, the rage warring against something else. Maybe relief that someone had finally stepped close instead of keeping a safe distance. "My nonna used to say something when I was little," Carmen continued, her voice soft. She switched to Italian, the language of her childhood, of Sunday dinners and nonna's kitchen that always smelled like rising dough. "Quando il cuore grida, le mani distruggono, ma distruggere non guarisce." When the heart screams, the hands destroy. But destroying doesn't heal. Nico went completely still. The chair slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. His eyes were wide, shocked, the rage draining from his face so fast it left him looking lost. "What did you say?" His voice was barely a whisper. "It's an old Neapolitan saying. My grandmother—" "My mother used to say that." The words burst out of him like a confession. "Exactly that. When I was 8 and I'd break my toys when I was mad. She'd say that and then she'd. He stopped, his throat working. She's dead. She's been dead for 7 years, and nobody ever says her words anymore. The hallway had gone silent. Even Patterson had stopped trying to intervene, everyone watching this strange moment unfold between the cafeteria worker and the violent boy. Carmen took the final steps between them, close enough now that she could see the unshed tears making Nico's eyes bright. What would she say after? After the words about destroying? Nico's voice cracked. La guarigione viene dal lasciare che qualcuno ti veda. Healing comes from letting someone see you. Then let someone see you, Carmen said gently. Let them see past the anger to what's really hurting. The boy's face crumpled. All the rage, all the violence, all the desperate fury collapsed inward, and what remained was just a 16-year-old kid who'd lost his mother too young and never figured out how to grieve properly. He made a sound that was half sob, half gasp, and his legs seemed to give out. He sank to the floor amid the wreckage he'd created, pulling his knees to his chest and burying his face in his arms. Carmen knelt beside him, not touching, but present. She didn't try to comfort him with platitudes or empty promises. She just stayed there while he cried, his shoulders shaking with sobs he'd probably been holding back for years. The teachers started to approach, but Carmen held up a hand, keeping them back. This moment was too fragile, too raw for adult intervention and consequences. Those could come later. Right now, Nico needed to break, really break, in a way that didn't involve furniture and violence. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Nico's crying slowed. He wiped his face on his sleeve, leaving streaks of tears and probably snot, looking younger than ever. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to. I just couldn't." "I know." Carmen kept her voice low. "Sometimes it builds up until it has to come out somehow. They're going to expel me." He said it flatly, like a fact he'd already accepted. "This is my 3rd school in 2 years. Nobody wants to deal with me. Maybe nobody's been speaking the right language." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the question forming. "How did you know those words?" "My mother's words?" "My nonna raised me after my parents died. She was from Naples originally, came here when she was 20. She had a lot of sayings." Carmen smiled slightly. "That was one of her favorites when I'd throw tantrums. My mother was from Positano, same region." Nico's voice had lost its sharp edges, going soft with memory. "She'd make this lemon cake that tasted like sunshine. I can still remember the smell of it baking." "Torta caprese al limone?" His eyes widened. "Yeah, exactly that. How?" "My nonna made it too. Every Easter." Carmen felt her own throat tighten with old grief. "She died 3 years ago. Cancer." They sat in the debris of his outburst, 2 people connected by Italian grandmothers and Neapolitan sayings and the particular loneliness that came from losing the people who'd loved you in a language no one else spoke anymore. "Nico." Patterson's voice broke the moment, more gentle than before but still carrying authority. "I need you to come with me now. Your father is on his way." The boy tensed immediately, fear flashing across his face before he masked it. "How long?" "He'll be here in 20 minutes. Nico stood, Carmen rising with him. He looked at the destruction he'd caused, the overturned desk, the broken chairs, the scattered papers, and something like shame crossed his expression. "Am I arrested?" he asked quietly. "No, but there will be consequences." Patterson's tone was surprisingly kind. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up before your father arrives." As Patterson led Nico toward the administrative offices, the boy looked back at Carmen. "Thank you," he mouthed. She nodded, watching him disappear around the corner. The other teachers were already moving, picking up debris, righting furniture, returning the hallway to order as if nothing had happened. Within minutes, the only evidence of the incident was some scuff marks on the marble and a slight dent in the wall where the chair had hit. Carmen returned to the cafeteria, her hands shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. She pulled off her rubber gloves and splashed cold water on her face at the industrial sink, trying to process what had just happened. She'd calmed down a violent teenager using her dead grandmother's words. Words that happened to be the same words his dead mother had used. The coincidence felt too big, too significant to be random chance. That was incredible. The voice made Carmen turn. Mr. Patterson stood in the cafeteria doorway, looking at her with something like awe. Nobody's ever gotten through to Nico Bellini like that. Not therapists, not counselors, not his father. How did you do it? I just talked to him. Carmen dried her hands on her apron. In Italian. You spoke Italian and he just stopped. Patterson shook his head. Do you have any idea how many incidents we've had with that boy? How many thousands his father has paid in damages to keep him enrolled here? The name finally registered. Bellini. Carmen had heard that name before, whispered in the same tones people used when discussing the Chicago mob families that supposedly didn't exist anymore, but somehow still controlled half the city's construction contracts and waterfront property. His father is Dante Bellini, Patterson continued, lowering his voice. You know that name? I've heard it. Everyone in Chicago had heard the Bellini name. Old money mixed with old power, the kind of family that had built the city in less legitimate ways and now hid behind legitimate business fronts while still controlling vast criminal enterprises. I didn't realize his son went here. We don't advertise it. For safety reasons? Patterson glanced behind him as if checking they were alone. The boy's been trouble since his mother died 7 years ago. Gets into fights, destroys property, gets expelled from every school that tries to accommodate him. His father keeps paying, keeps moving him, but nothing works. Until today. Carmen felt increasingly uncomfortable with this conversation. I should get back to prep work. Lunch is in an hour. Wait. Patterson pulled out his phone. I need to call Mr. Bellini and tell him what happened. He'll want to know about you, about how you managed to reach Nico. Please don't. The last thing Carmen wanted was attention from someone like Dante Bellini. I just did what anyone would do. But that's exactly it. No one else did it. No one else could. Patterson was already dialing. This could change everything for that boy. His father needs to know. Carmen wanted to argue, wanted to insist on remaining invisible, but Patterson had already turned away, phone to his ear. She returned to her prep work, trying to lose herself in the familiar rhythms of chopping vegetables and stirring sauce, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. 20 minutes later, she heard voices in the hallway outside the cafeteria. Deep male voices, one that carried the weight of authority and anger barely held in check. Where is she? In the cafeteria, Mr. Bellini. But if I could just explain, you've had 3 incidents with my son this semester. 3. And some cafeteria worker fixes it with a conversation. I need to understand what happened. Carmen set down her knife and wiped her hands on her apron, preparing for whatever came next. She'd dealt with angry customers at her bakery, had learned to keep her composure under pressure. But something told her Dante Bellini was in an entirely different category. The man who entered the cafeteria wasn't what she expected. She'd pictured someone older, harder, more overtly threatening. But Dante Bellini looked like he could have been a CEO or a lawyer, mid-40s, tall and lean in an expensive charcoal suit, dark hair touched with gray at the temples. His face was all sharp angles and controlled intensity, handsome in a way that was almost unsettling because of how carefully it was composed. But it was his eyes that stopped her. Dark brown, almost black, and absolutely ruthless. These were eyes that had seen violence, had probably ordered violence, and felt no particular remorse about either. Those eyes fixed on Carmen with laser focus, assessing her in seconds. She resisted the urge to look away, meeting his gaze with what she hoped was calm professionalism. "You're the cafeteria worker." It wasn't a question. "Carmen DeLuca, yes. Tell me exactly what you said to my son." Carmen glanced at Patterson, who hovered in the doorway looking nervous. "I just spoke to him in Italian. Quoted an old saying my grandmother used to tell me." "What saying?" Dante's voice was dangerously quiet. "Quando il cuore grida, le mani distruggono, ma distruggere non guarisce." Carmen kept her voice steady. "When the heart screams, the hands destroy, but destroying doesn't heal." Something flickered across Dante's face. Shock, maybe, or grief, quickly suppressed. He took a step closer to her, and Carmen forced herself not to back away. "That's what my wife used to tell Nico." Her exact words. "Where did you learn them?" "My grandmother. She was from Naples. My wife was from Positano." Dante's jaw clenched. "She died 7 years ago. Nico hasn't heard those words since." "He told me." Carmen met his eyes. "When I said them, he stopped. Completely. Like something in him just released." "And then what?" "He cried. And then Mr. Patterson took him to the office." Dante turned to Patterson. "Is my son in trouble?" "Well, there was significant property damage, and we have policies." "How much?" Dante pulled out his wallet. "For the damages." "That's not really the point, Mr. Bellini. We need to discuss Nico's ongoing behavioral issues and whether Riverside is the right fit." "I'll triple your usual donation to the school if we can skip the part where you threaten to expel him." Dante's tone made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. "My son is staying here, and if he has another incident, I want Miss DeLuca called immediately." Carmen's head snapped up. "Excuse me?" Dante's attention returned to her. "You clearly have some ability to reach him that no one else has demonstrated. I'll compensate you for your time. I'm not a therapist or a counselor. I make spaghetti for teenagers. You speak Italian. You knew the exact words that reached my son when nothing else has worked in 7 years." Dante pulled out a business card, black with silver lettering. "This is my private number. When Nico has an incident, not if, when, someone will call you and you'll talk to him. Name your price." "I don't want money for talking to a kid." Carmen felt her temper rising despite the warning voice in her head telling her not to antagonize this man. He needed someone to see past the anger. That's not a job. "Everything is a job, Miss DeLuca. I'm merely ensuring you're compensated fairly." Dante set the card on the counter between them. "I'll make a donation to the school in your name. Consider it a bonus for services rendered." He turned to leave, clearly considering the conversation over. "Mr. Bellini." Carmen's voice stopped him at the doorway. "Your son doesn't need someone who's paid to care about him. He needs someone who actually does." Dante looked back at her, and for just a moment, the controlled mask slipped. She saw exhaustion there, and grief, and the particular desperation of a parent who'd tried everything and watched his child suffer anyway. "If you can give him that," Dante said quietly, "then whatever you want, it's yours. Money, a different job, anything. Just help my son." Then he was gone, leaving Carmen standing in the industrial cafeteria, holding a business card that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, wondering how a simple act of kindness had just pulled her into the orbit of one of Chicago's most dangerous families. Patterson lingered in the doorway. "You should feel honored. Dante Bellini doesn't ask for help from anyone." "I'm not honored. I'm terrified." Carmen stared at the card. "I don't want to be involved with people like that." "Too late. You're already involved." Patterson's expression was sympathetic. "The boy responded to you. His father noticed. In their world, that makes you valuable. And valuable people don't get to say no." After he left, Carmen returned to her prep work, but her mind was spinning. She thought about Nico's face when she'd spoken his mother's words, about the way 7 years of rage had crumbled into tears, about a boy who'd been drowning alone because everyone around him was too afraid or too incompetent to throw him a line. She thought about Dante Bellini's eyes, about the barely contained desperation beneath the cold control, about a father who'd buy anything and threaten anyone if it meant saving his son. And she thought about her Nona, who'd believed that the language you spoke in grief mattered, that certain words carried healing in their sound and shape, that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could change everything. The lunch bell rang. Students flooded into the cafeteria, loud and hungry and blissfully unaware of the incident that had happened just hours before. Carmen served pasta and smiled mechanically, and tried to lose herself in routine. But the black business card stayed in her pocket, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully rebuilt, safely invisible life had just ended. Nico Bellini needed someone to see him. His father was willing to pay any price for that. And Carmen, despite every survival instinct screaming at her to stay away from the Bellini family and their dangerous world, couldn't stop thinking about a 16-year-old boy crying in a hallway full of broken furniture because nobody had spoken his mother's language in 7 years. 3 days passed before Carmen heard from the Bellini family again. 3 days of serving lunch to teenagers who whispered about Nico's outburst, of catching curious glances from teachers who now knew she was somehow connected to Chicago's most notorious crime family, of carrying that black business card in her pocket like a ticking bomb she couldn't bring herself to throw away. She'd almost convinced herself that Dante Bellini had forgotten about her, that his desperate promise in the cafeteria had been just words spoken in a moment of parental panic. Almost. Then Thursday afternoon, as Carmen was finishing her shift and scrubbing down the industrial ovens, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But something, instinct, curiosity, the memory of Nico's tear-stained face, made her pull off her rubber gloves and swipe to accept the call. Miss DeLuca. The voice was female, professional, efficient. This is Angela Russo calling on behalf of Mr. Dante Bellini. Mr. Bellini would like to meet with you this evening to discuss an arrangement regarding his son. Are you available at 7? Carmen's first instinct was to say no, to make excuses about being tired, having plans, needing to wash her hair or reorganize her spice cabinet or literally anything that didn't involve meeting with a mob boss. I don't think that's necessary, she managed. I was just trying to help during a difficult situation. There's nothing to discuss. Mr. Bellini was quite insistent. Angela's tone suggested she was reading from a script, one that didn't include the option for Carmen to decline. A car will pick you up from your apartment at 6:30. The address I have is 2847 West Diversey, apartment 3B. Is that correct? Ice slid down Carmen's spine. She'd never given anyone from the Bellini family her address. How did you? 6:30, Miss DeLuca. Please be ready. The line went dead. Carmen stared at her phone, her heart hammering. They knew where she lived. Of course they did. People like Dante Bellini didn't make requests without first ensuring they had all the information they needed, including exactly where to find you if you tried to refuse. She should have thrown away that business card. Should have insisted to Patterson that her name be kept out of any reports. Should have stayed in the kitchen where she belonged instead of walking into that hallway and speaking Italian to a boy who was drowning in grief. But she'd done all those things, and now a car was coming to take her to meet with a man who could make people disappear with a phone call. Carmen finished her shift on autopilot, scrubbing and organizing while her mind spun through increasingly paranoid scenarios. By the time she left Riverside Prep at 5, she'd half convinced herself not to be at her apartment when the car arrived. She could go to a friend's place, or a movie theater, or just walk around the city until it was clear she wasn't cooperating. Except she didn't really have friends anymore. The bankruptcy had stripped away most of her social circle, People who'd been customers first and friends second, who'd drifted away when the bakery closed and she'd stopped being useful. And running from Dante Bellini seemed like an excellent way to make her situation significantly worse. So at 6:15, Carmen stood in her tiny bathroom, staring at her reflection and trying to decide if she should change out of her work clothes. The practical polo shirt and khaki pants that comprised her cafeteria uniform seemed wildly inappropriate for whatever this meeting entailed, but she didn't exactly own power suits or designer dresses. She settled on dark jeans and a simple black sweater, the nicest things she owned that weren't stained with tomato sauce. Her dark hair, usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, she left down, falling past her shoulders in waves she rarely bothered to style. At 6:29, her doorbell buzzed. Carmen grabbed her jacket and purse, hands shaking slightly as she locked her apartment door. In the lobby, a man in a black suit waited, his stance screaming security or bodyguard or whatever term people like the Bellinis used for the people who handled their violent work. Miss DeLuca? He was maybe 40, with the kind of build that came from serious gym time and the kind of face that suggested he'd seen things he'd prefer to forget. "I'm Vincent. I'll be driving you this evening." "Where exactly are we going?" Carmen asked as he opened the door to a black sedan parked illegally in front of her building. "Mr. Bellini's restaurant. Bella Notte in the West Loop." Vincent held the back door open, waiting with patient expectation. Carmen slid into the leather interior, noting the tinted windows that made it impossible to see in from the street. Vincent got behind the wheel and pulled smoothly into traffic, driving with the confidence of someone who knew these streets intimately. The drive took 20 minutes through evening traffic. Carmen watched the city slide past her window, her neighborhood of aging walk-ups giving way to the gentrified West Loop with its trendy restaurants and converted lofts. Bella Notte occupied a corner building that had probably once been a warehouse, all exposed brick and industrial windows, the kind of place that charged $40 for a pasta dish and had a 6-month waiting list for reservations. Vincent parked in a restricted zone without hesitation and came around to open Carmen's door. "Mr. Bellini is waiting in the private dining room, 3rd floor." The restaurant's interior was all low lighting and dark wood, surprisingly elegant for something connected to organized crime. A hostess looked up as they entered, her professional smile widening when she saw Vincent. "He's expecting you," she said, gesturing toward a private elevator at the back of the dining room. "3rd floor, door on your right." Carmen's legs felt disconnected from her body as she stepped into the elevator. Vincent didn't follow, just nodded once as the doors closed, leaving her alone with her racing thoughts and the soft jazz piped through hidden speakers. The 3rd floor was quieter, more intimate. The elevator opened directly into a small hallway with only 2 doors. Carmen knocked on the one to the right, her knuckles barely making a sound against the heavy wood. "Come in," Dante Bellini's voice carried clearly through the door. The private dining room was smaller than Carmen expected, dominated by a single table set for 2. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the Chicago skyline, the city lights beginning to glitter as dusk settled. Dante stood near the windows, wearing dark slacks and a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, looking somehow more dangerous in casual clothes than he had in his business suit. "Miss DeLuca?" He turned as she entered, gesturing to one of the chairs. "Thank you for coming." "I'm not sure I had much choice." Carmen remained standing. "Your assistant knew my address." That felt less like an invitation and more like a summons. Something that might have been approval flickered across Dante's face. "You're direct. I appreciate that." He moved to the table, pulling out a chair. "Please, sit. I promise this isn't an interrogation." Carmen sat because standing felt increasingly awkward, though every instinct told her she was making a mistake. Dante took the seat across from her, close enough that she could see the gray threading through his dark hair, the fine lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled less than he frowned. Have you eaten? He asked. I'm not hungry. You will be. Dante pressed a button on the table, and within seconds, a server appeared carrying a tray with appetizers: bruschetta, calamari, caprese salad. The chef here is exceptional. Trained in Naples, actually. The food appeared without Carmen ordering, course after course of Italian cuisine that was undeniably excellent. She ate mechanically, too nervous to really taste anything, while Dante watched her with that same assessing gaze that made her feel like a problem he was trying to solve. How long have you worked at Riverside? He asked after the server had brought wine neither of them had requested. 8 months. And before that? I owned a bakery in Little Italy. It went under. Carmen met his eyes. Is this relevant to your son? Everything about you is relevant if you're going to be involved with my son. Dante leaned back in his chair. I need to know who you are, what your background is, whether you can be trusted. Trusted with what exactly? Carmen set down her fork. Mr. Bellini, I appreciate the meal, but I don't understand what you want from me. I spoke to Nico in Italian during a crisis. That doesn't make me qualified to be his therapist or counselor or whatever you're imagining. You're right. It doesn't. Dante's expression remained neutral. What makes you qualified is that you're the only person in 7 years who's gotten through to him. Do you understand what that means? That I happen to know the right words at the right time? No. Dante leaned forward, intensity radiating from him. It means you saw my son. Not the violence, not the anger, not the problem that needs fixing. You saw the grief underneath and you spoke to it in a language he understood. That's not luck or coincidence. That's connection. Carmen felt something tighten in her chest. I'm not qualified for this. I don't have a degree in psychology or child development. You said you were in graduate school for childhood development before your bakery. The fact that he knew that made Carmen's skin prickle. I didn't finish the program. I got 2 semesters in before I had to drop out. Why childhood development? Dante asked, his gaze never leaving her face. Why not business management or culinary arts? Carmen hesitated, not wanting to share personal details with this man, but recognizing that he'd probably already investigated her background thoroughly. My parents died when I was 12. Car accident. I went to live with my nonna, and she saved me. Taught me Italian, taught me to bake, taught me that grief doesn't destroy you if someone's there to hold you through it. She met his eyes. I wanted to do that for other kids. Be the person who sees them when they're drowning. Something in Dante's expression softened, just slightly. My wife used to say something similar, that children who lose their mothers too young need someone to speak their mother's language, literally and figuratively. Is that what happened to Nico? He lost his mother and nobody spoke her language anymore? Yes. The single word carried years of regret. Maria died of ovarian cancer when Nico was 9. It was brutal. 2 years of hospitals and treatments and false hope before she finally... He stopped, his jaw clenching. Afterward, I tried to give him stability, structure, therapy, counselors, the best schools. But he kept getting worse, more violent, more angry, getting expelled from every place that tried to help him. Because nobody was speaking Italian, Carmen said quietly. Nobody was using his mother's words and phrases. They were treating the behavior without understanding the grief. Exactly. Dante's hands clenched on the table. I speak Italian to him sometimes, but it's not the same. Maria had these sayings, these phrases from her grandmother in Positano. I didn't memorize them all. I thought we'd have more time for him to remember them on his own. But grief isn't about remembering, Carmen said. It's about being reminded by someone else that the person you lost was real, that they mattered, that their words still have power. Dante stared at her for a long moment. You understand. I lost my nonna 3 years ago. Every time I make her lemon cake or say one of her phrases, It's like she's alive again for just a moment. Carmen's throat tightened. Your son needed that. Needed to hear his mother's voice through someone else's words. And that's why I need you. Dante's tone shifted to something more businesslike. I want to hire you to work with Nico, not as a therapist. We have those. But as someone who can reach him when he starts to spiral. Someone who speaks his mother's language and understands what he needs. Carmen shook her head. I have a job. I can't just... I'll pay you 3 times what you make at Riverside. 4 times if you're willing to be available outside school hours. Dante pulled out a folder she hadn't noticed, sliding it across the table. I've had my people draw up a contract, part-time position as a family consultant, with generous compensation and benefits. Carmen opened the folder, her eyes widening at the salary figure listed. It was more money than she'd made in a year at her bakery, for what amounted to talking to a teenager in Italian occasionally. This is insane, she breathed. Nobody pays this much for what you're describing? I do. Because my son's well-being is worth more than any amount of money. Dante's expression was absolutely serious. You'll work your regular shifts at Riverside, but when Nico has an incident, my assistant will call you and you'll come talk to him. At school, at our home, wherever he needs you. And once a week, I want you to have dinner with us. Speak Italian, share your Nona's stories, help Nico remember his mother's language in a context that isn't about crisis management. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The offer was tempting in ways Carmen hadn't expected. The money would solve so many problems. She could pay off the remaining business debts, build an emergency fund, maybe even start thinking about going back to finish her degree. But accepting meant becoming entangled with the Bellini family, with their dangerous world of violence and criminal enterprise. What happens if I say no? She asked quietly. Dante's expression didn't change. Nothing. You walk away and I find someone else. But there isn't anyone else, Miss DeLuca. In 7 years, you're the first person who's reached my son. If you walk away from him now, you'll be just another person who saw him suffering and chose not to help. The manipulation was obvious, but it worked anyway. Carmen thought about Nico crying in that hallway, about the desperation in his voice when he'd asked if his mother's words meant someone else still remembered her. I need guarantees, Carmen said finally. I'm not doing anything illegal. I'm not covering up violence or helping him avoid consequences. If he hurts someone, we call the authorities. Agreed. And I can quit any time if this arrangement isn't working. No retaliation, no pressure, no... She gestured vaguely. Mob consequences. Dante's mouth twitched slightly, almost a smile. No mob consequences. You have my word. The word of a crime boss isn't exactly reassuring. Then how about this? You have my word as a father. The intensity in his voice was unmistakable. Everything I do is to protect my son. You're helping me do that. Why would I hurt someone who's helping Nico? Carmen studied him. This dangerous man who ran criminal enterprises and probably had blood on his hands, and saw only a desperate father willing to do anything to save his child. It didn't excuse what he was, but it made him human in a way that was hard to ignore. 1-month trial, she said. We try this arrangement for 1 month. If it's not working, we reassess. 1 month. Dante extended his hand across the table. Deal. Carmen shook his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. This was a man who'd built an empire with those hands, who'd probably used them to commit violence she didn't want to imagine. But right now, they were just the hands of a father who'd run out of options. When do I start? She asked. Tonight, if you're willing. Nico's home. He's been asking about you since the incident. Dante stood, pulling out his phone. I'll have Vincent drive you to the house. Wait, tonight? I thought we were talking about... There's no point in delaying. The sooner you start building rapport with Nico, the better. Dante was already texting someone. Besides, he needs to understand that you're not just someone who appeared once. You're going to be present in his life consistently. Carmen felt like she'd been swept up in a current too strong to fight against. Within minutes, she was back in Vincent's sedan, driving through Chicago's northwest suburbs toward an address she hadn't agreed to visit, but somehow couldn't refuse. The Bellini house, mansion, really, sat behind tall iron gates in a neighborhood where the lawns were measured in acres rather than square feet. Security cameras tracked their progress up the long driveway. The house itself was modern, all glass and clean lines, the kind of architecture that suggested wealth, but not ostentation. Vincent led her through the front entrance into a foyer with marble floors and art on the walls that was probably worth more than Carmen's entire life savings. A woman in her 50s appeared, wearing business casual and an expression of professional efficiency. Miss DeLuca, I'm Angela. We spoke on the phone. She extended her hand. Mr. Bellini called ahead. Nico is in the library. I'll take you to him. The library was 2 floors of books surrounding a central atrium, with leather furniture and ladders on tracks for reaching the higher shelves. It looked like something from a movie, and sitting in the middle of it, hunched over a textbook, was Nico Bellini. He looked different outside of school. Smaller somehow, younger in jeans and a hoodie, his dark hair still messy but in a deliberate way, rather than the chaos of his outburst. He glanced up as Angela led Carmen in, and his eyes widened with recognition. You came, he said, almost disbelieving. Your father invited me. Carmen moved closer, noting the textbooks spread across the table. Calculus, AP Literature, Chemistry. How are you? Better? Nico closed the calculus book. They didn't expel me. Dad paid for the damages, and I'm on probation, but I can stay at Riverside. That's good. Carmen pulled out a chair, sitting across from him. Have you had any other incidents since Thursday? No, but it's only been 3 days. He looked at her with those 2 old eyes, the ones that had seen too much grief too young. Dad said you're going to be working with me, like a tutor or something? Something like that. I'm supposed to speak Italian with you, help you remember your mother's language. Carmen kept her tone casual. Your dad thinks it might help with the anger. Do you think it will help? The question was genuine, vulnerable. I don't know, Carmen admitted. But I know that grief is easier when you can share it in the language you first learned it in. My nonna taught me that. Nico was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming on the textbook. Can you tell me about your nonna? What was she like? So Carmen did. She talked about Nonna's kitchen in Little Italy, about learning to make pasta from scratch at 8 years old, about the way her grandmother had held her through panic attacks after her parents died and whispered Italian prayers until Carmen could breathe again. She talked about the bakery they'd dreamed of opening together, about how Nonna had lived just long enough to see the grand opening before the cancer took her. Nico listened with complete attention, and gradually his body language shifted from defensive to open. He started asking questions about recipes, about Italian phrases, about what it felt like to lose someone who'd been your whole world. Mama used to make this soup, he said eventually, his voice soft. Zuppa di pesce. She'd make it every Christmas Eve, and the whole house would smell like garlic and tomatoes and the ocean somehow. Dad tried to make it once after she died, but it wasn't the same. He didn't know all the ingredients. Did your mom write down the recipe? Carmen asked. There's a cookbook in the kitchen with some of her recipes, but the soup one is in Italian and I can't read it well enough to follow it. Nico looked at her hopefully. Could we try making it sometime? Together? I'd like that. Carmen smiled. My nonna's zuppa di pesce was legendary. Maybe between your mother's recipe and my nonna's techniques, we can recreate it. They talked for another hour, switching between English and Italian, with Carmen teaching him phrases and sayings that Nonna had used, and Nico sharing memories of his mother that he clearly hadn't spoken aloud in years. The grief was still there, still raw, but it had space to exist now, without exploding into violence. Dante appeared in the doorway around 9, and Carmen was surprised to realize how much time had passed. Nico, you have school tomorrow. Say goodnight. Can Carmen come back on Friday? Nico asked, looking between them. For dinner. We could try making Mama's soup. Dante's gaze met Carmen's over his son's head, and she saw the gratitude there, mixed with something that looked like hope. If Miss DeLuca is willing. I'm willing, Carmen said. Friday evening, we'll make soup. Vincent drove her home through the dark city, and Carmen stared out the window at the passing lights, trying to process what had just happened. She'd gone from cafeteria worker to family consultant for Chicago's most powerful crime family in less than a week. She'd signed a contract that paid her more money than she'd ever imagined making. And she'd promised to help a grieving 16-year-old boy remember his dead mother through recipes and Italian phrases. It was insane. It was dangerous. Was probably the worst decision she'd ever made. But when she thought about Nico's face as they'd talked, about the way his shoulders had relaxed and his eyes had brightened when sharing memories of his mother, Carmen couldn't bring herself to regret it. Some things mattered more than safety. Sometimes helping someone else heal was the only way to heal yourself. And maybe, just maybe, this was why she'd survived losing her parents and her nonna and her bakery. Not to serve lunch to privileged teenagers, but to speak a dead woman's language to a boy who was drowning in grief. Carmen fell asleep that night with her copy of the contract on her nightstand and the echo of Nico's laughter, real, genuine laughter, playing on repeat in her mind. 1-month trial. She could do this for 1 month. And if Dante Bellini's world proved too dangerous, if the arrangement became untenable, she'd walk away. But looking at the contract, at the salary that could change her life, at the memory of a boy who'd finally stopped screaming long enough to remember how to smile, Carmen suspected she was already too invested to walk away, even if she wanted to. Friday evening arrived with the kind of bitter November cold that made Chicago feel like it was preparing for a long winter siege. Carmen stood outside Bella Notte at 6 o'clock, clutching a canvas bag containing her nonna's handwritten recipe book and a collection of dried herbs she'd brought from home, wondering if she was making a catastrophic mistake. Vincent appeared from inside the restaurant, holding the door open with his usual patient professionalism. Miss DeLuca, Mr. Bellini is waiting upstairs. He asked me to bring you up when you arrived. The private kitchen on the 4th floor was nothing like the industrial cafeteria workspace Carmen was used to. This was a home kitchen transplanted into a restaurant building. Marble countertops, professional-grade appliances, copper pots hanging from ceiling racks, and windows overlooking the city skyline. Dante stood at the island, sleeves rolled up, reviewing what looked like his wife's cookbook. "You're early," he said, glancing up. "Nico is finishing homework. He'll be here in 20 minutes. I wanted time to review the recipe before we started." Carmen set her bag on the counter, pulling out her nonna's book. Zuppa di pesce can be temperamental. The timing has to be perfect, or the seafood gets rubbery. Dante moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated with notes of cedar. He opened his wife's cookbook to a page marked with a faded ribbon, and Carmen saw the recipe written in elegant Italian script. "Maria wrote this 2 years before she died," Dante said quietly, his finger tracing the handwriting. She knew she was getting sicker, knew she might not be here to teach Nico how to make the dishes she'd learned from her own mother, so she wrote everything down, every detail. Carmen studied the recipe, comparing it to her nonna's version. They were similar but not identical. Maria's used more tomato. Nonna's relied on white wine for depth. We could combine them, use the best elements from each. Nico would like that, knowing his mother's recipe was good enough to stand alongside your nonna's. Dante pulled out pots and pans with the efficiency of someone who knew this kitchen well. Do you cook here often? Carmen asked, surprised by his familiarity with the space. I built this kitchen 5 years ago, after Maria died. Couldn't bear to cook in our home kitchen without her. But Nico needed to eat, and I needed... He paused, his jaw tightening. I needed something to do with my hands that wasn't violence. Turns out cooking is meditative when you let it be. The admission surprised her. Carmen had imagined Dante Bellini as someone who delegated everything, who had people to cook and clean and handle the mundane aspects of life. But here he was, pulling out a cutting board and a chef's knife with the comfortable competence of someone who'd spent hours in this space. They worked in silence for a few minutes, Carmen chopping garlic and parsley while Dante prepared the seafood: mussels, clams, shrimp, chunks of firm white fish. The rhythm was familiar and soothing, the kind of pre-cooking meditation that Carmen had learned from Nonna, where the preparation was as important as the final dish. Why did you really agree to this? Dante asked suddenly, not looking up from the shrimp he was deveining. The money is good, yes, but I've learned to recognize when someone's motivated purely by compensation versus something else. You're the latter. Carmen considered lying, offering some bland explanation about wanting to help or needing the income. But something about the quiet intimacy of the kitchen, about standing beside this dangerous man while they prepared his dead wife's recipe, demanded honesty. Because I know what it's like to be Nico, she said finally. After my parents died, I was angry all the time. I'd scream at my nonna, break things, hurt myself just to feel something other than the crushing grief. Everyone said I needed therapy, medication, behavioral modification. But what I really needed was someone who understood that I wasn't broken. I was just speaking a language nobody else knew anymore. And your grandmother understood that language? She did. She'd lost her husband, her daughter, her son-in-law. She knew grief isn't something you fix. It's something you learn to carry. Carmen set down her knife, turning to face him. Your son isn't violent because he's broken. He's violent because he's drowning and nobody's throwing him the right lifeline. Until you. Dante's dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. You threw him exactly the right lifeline, in exactly the right language, at exactly the right moment. Do you understand how rare that is? Or how lucky? I happen to know the same phrases his mother used. That's coincidence, not skill. I don't believe in coincidences. Dante moved closer, close enough that Carmen had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. I believe in patterns, in connections, in the universe occasionally putting the right person in the right place for reasons we don't fully understand. The moment stretched between them, charged with something Carmen couldn't quite name. Then footsteps on the stairs broke the tension, and Nico burst into the kitchen with the kind of energy that suggested he'd been looking forward to this all day. You're here! He grinned at Carmen, then noticed the ingredients spread across the counter. Is that Mama's cookbook? Are we really making her soup? We're making a combination, Carmen explained, grateful for the interruption. Your mother's recipe and my nonna's technique, the best of both. They cooked together for the next 2 hours, Carmen guiding Nico through each step while Dante assisted from the periphery. She taught him how to tell when garlic was perfectly golden, not burned. How to layer flavors by adding wine at different stages. How to treat the seafood gently so it stayed tender. But more than cooking techniques, she taught him Italian. Not textbook Italian, but kitchen Italian. The phrases and exclamations and small prayers that turned cooking from a task into a ritual. When the soup burned slightly, Carmen muttered one of Nonna's favorite curses, and Nico laughed until tears streamed down his face. "Mama used to say that one," he exclaimed, "when she'd drop something or burn the bread. I'd forgotten about it completely." "Language lives in the small moments," Carmen said, stirring the soup. "Not just the big declarations. Your mother's Italian wasn't in textbooks. It was in the way she moved through the world, the phrases she used for everyday things." They ate at the kitchen island, the three of them crowded together in a space clearly designed for more people. The soup was excellent, rich and complex, tasting of the ocean and tomatoes and wine, with layers of flavor that built with each bite. Nico ate 3 bowls, his face flushed with pride and something that looked like peace. "It tastes like Christmas," he said quietly, "like being 7 years old and helping Mama in the kitchen while Dad pretended he wasn't stealing shrimp when he thought we weren't looking." Dante smiled, genuine and unguarded, and Carmen saw what he must have looked like before grief and violence had carved lines around his eyes. "Your mother always made enough extra shrimp specifically for me to steal. She said if she didn't, I'd take them from the actual soup." They shared stories throughout the meal, Nico remembering his mother, Dante filling in details that Nico had been too young to notice, Carmen contributing memories of her own nonna that paralleled theirs in ways that felt less like coincidence and more like connection across time and loss. Around 9, Nico's eyes started to droop. Dante sent him to bed, and the boy hugged Carmen before leaving, a spontaneous gesture that surprised both of them. "Thank you," Nico whispered, "for helping me remember her. Not just the sad parts, the good parts too." After he left, Carmen and Dante cleaned the kitchen in companionable silence. She washed, he dried, and the domestic normalcy of it felt surreal, given that this man probably had people who handled such mundane tasks. But he seemed content with the routine, working methodically through the stack of dishes and pots. "He hasn't talked about Maria like that in years," Dante said eventually. "Not the happy memories. Only the grief, the loss, the anger at God for taking her." "Grief gets stuck sometimes," Carmen replied, scrubbing a pot. "It becomes the only story you can tell about the person you lost. But when someone else helps you remember the other stories, the joyful ones, the funny ones, it unsticks something, makes the person whole again in your memory instead of just a symbol of pain." "Is that what happened with your grandmother?" Carmen paused, hands in the sudsy water. "Eventually. It took 2 years before I could think about her without immediately crying. But then I'd remember something funny, like how she'd throw wooden spoons at my grandfather when he criticized her cooking, or how she'd sing opera while making pasta, completely off key. And suddenly she was a full person again, not just a loss." Dante set down the dish he'd been drying. "Can I ask you something personal?" "You're already asking me to help raise your son. I think we're past the boundary of impersonal." Carmen turned to face him, drying her hands on a towel. "Why didn't you finish your graduate program? You clearly have the passion for it, the instinct." "What happened?" Carmen sighed, the familiar weight of that failure settling over her. "Money, mostly. My nonna's medical bills wiped out our savings. After she died, I used what little she left me to open the bakery instead of going back to school. Seemed more practical. A business that could support me, rather than more student loans for a degree that might not lead to stable employment. But the bakery failed. Spectacularly." Carmen managed a weak smile. "Turns out passion and good recipes aren't enough to overcome bad location, rising rents, and competition from corporate chains. I was drowning in debt within 2 years, declared bankruptcy, lost everything, and ended up serving reheated pasta to teenagers." "That must have felt like failure." "It was failure." Carmen met his eyes. "I failed my nonna's memory by running her recipes into the ground, failed myself by not finishing my degree, failed at basically every dream I'd ever had. So yes, it felt like failure, because it was failure. And yet you're here, using those same instincts you would have developed in graduate school to help my son. Dante leaned against the counter. Failure isn't permanent unless you let it define you. That's very philosophical for a mob boss. His mouth twitched. I prefer businessman with complicated interests. Carmen laughed despite herself. Is that what we're calling it? You'd be surprised how much legitimate business I actually run. The restaurants, for instance. All completely legal. All profitable without any criminal enterprise attached. Dante's expression turned more serious. I won't pretend I'm not involved in things that would horrify you. I am. But I've been working for years to transition more of my operations to legitimate ventures, for Nico's sake, so he can inherit something other than blood and violence. Does he know about what you really do? He knows enough. That I'm not just a restaurant owner, that people fear me for reasons beyond my business acumen, but I've kept him insulated from the worst of it. Dante's jaw tightened. My father believed in raising sons in the family business from childhood. I watched him beat that education into my older brother until Lorenzo couldn't remember what it felt like to choose something for himself. I won't do that to Nico. Your brother, is he dead? Killed in a territorial dispute when I was 25. Which is how I ended up running things instead of Lorenzo. Dante's voice was flat, emotionless. The life expectancy for men in my position isn't great. That's why I want Nico to have options. Real options. A future that doesn't end with him bleeding out in an alley before he's 40. The casual way he discussed his own potential violent death made Carmen's stomach turn. How do you live like that, knowing any day could be your last? You just do. And you make sure that the people you love are protected if something happens. Dante pulled out his phone, showing her a document. This is Nico's trust fund. If I die, he's provided for. College, graduate school, whatever he needs to build a legitimate life. You're listed as a trustee now, along with my lawyer and my sister. If something happens to me, I need to know Nico will have people around him who see him as more than a meal ticket or a pawn in territorial disputes. Carmen stared at the document, her name listed in official legal language alongside people she'd never met. You barely know me. Why would you trust me with that? Because in 1 week, you've given my son something I couldn't provide in 7 years, permission to grieve in his mother's language. That's not something a mercenary does. That's something someone who genuinely cares does. Dante's dark eyes held hers. I'm a good judge of character, Miss DeLuca. I have to be to survive in my world, and everything about you says you're someone who can be trusted with what matters most. The weight of that trust settled over Carmen like a physical thing. She was being pulled deeper into the Bellini family's orbit, given responsibilities she'd never asked for, trusted with a child's future in ways that felt both honoring and terrifying. What if I mess this up? She asked quietly. What if I say the wrong thing? Or Nico has another incident and I can't reach him, or then we try again, and again, until we find what works. Dante moved closer, his presence overwhelming in the quiet kitchen. You're not expected to be perfect, Carmen. You're just expected to keep trying, to keep showing up, to keep speaking the language Nico needs to hear. It was the first time he'd used her first name, and the intimacy of it made her breath catch. They stood too close, the air between them charged with something that went beyond professional boundaries, beyond the simple arrangement of helping his son. I should go, Carmen said, but didn't move. It's late. Vincent can drive you home. But Dante didn't step back either. The moment stretched, both of them aware they were crossing some invisible line, neither quite willing to be the first to retreat. Then Dante's phone buzzed, shattering the tension. He glanced at it, his expression immediately hardening. I need to take this. Work emergency. He looked at Carmen, and she saw the regret there mixed with relief at the interruption. Vincent is downstairs. Thank you for tonight. For Nico. Carmen gathered her things, the spell broken, and let Vincent drive her home through the dark city. But all she could think about was the way Dante had looked at her in that kitchen, the trust he'd placed in her, the dangerous attraction she'd felt building despite every logical reason to maintain distance. She was falling into something complicated and potentially catastrophic. She could feel it happening, could feel herself getting attached not just to Nico but to Dante, to the small moments of domesticity and vulnerability they'd shared over soup and stories. This was supposed to be a job. A 1-month trial to help a grieving teenager, but it was becoming something else. Something that involved late-night cooking and discussions about trust and being listed on legal documents as someone important enough to help shape a child's future. Carmen lay in bed that night, staring at her ceiling, trying to convince herself she could maintain professional boundaries, that she could help Nico without getting emotionally entangled with his father, that she could walk away in 3 weeks if the arrangement became too complicated. But she knew, with the kind of certainty that lived in her gut, that it was already too late for boundaries. She was invested. In Nico's healing, in Dante's desperate attempt to be a better father than his own had been, in the fragile family unit they were building from grief and Italian phrases and her nonna's recipes. 3 weeks left in her trial period. 3 weeks to figure out if she could survive in the orbit of the Bellini family without getting burned. Or 3 weeks to realize she'd already made her choice, and walking away was no longer an option. The next 2 weeks passed in a pattern that began to feel almost normal. Carmen worked her shifts at Riverside Prep, and 3 times she was called to handle Nico's incidents, smaller ones than the chair-throwing episode, but still volatile enough that the teachers couldn't manage them alone. Each time, she'd arrive to find Nico spiraling, once in the bathroom where he'd punched a mirror, once in the gym where he'd destroyed equipment, once in the parking lot where he'd been trying to leave school grounds without permission. And each time, she'd speak to him in Italian, using phrases and sayings that pulled him back from whatever edge he was approaching. The incidents decreased in frequency. By the end of the second week, Nico had gone 4 full days without any violent outbursts, and his teachers reported he was participating more in class, completing homework, even smiling occasionally. "Whatever you're doing is working," Principal Hayes told Carmen during a brief meeting. "I've never seen transformation like this. The boy is actually manageable now." But Carmen knew it wasn't transformation. It was just Nico learning he could grieve without destroying things, that his mother's memory could live in everyday conversations and cooking sessions rather than only in the violence of his rage. Every Friday she had dinner with the Bellinis. Sometimes they cooked together, making pasta from scratch, attempting Maria's more complicated recipes, laughing over kitchen disasters. Sometimes they ordered takeout and ate while Nico did homework, and Carmen helped him with Italian translations for his language class. Dante was present for all of it, a watchful guardian who participated but never dominated. He'd ask about Carmen's week, about her own memories of loss, about the graduate program she'd never finished. He listened with an intensity that suggested he was cataloging information, building a complete picture of who she was. And Carmen found herself doing the same, learning about Dante through the small moments. The way he was patient with Nico's math homework even when the boy got frustrated. How he'd unconsciously touch Maria's cookbook when they cooked her recipes, his fingers tracing her handwriting. The rare occasions when his guard dropped and she'd see genuine laughter or unguarded affection. He was more than the dangerous reputation suggested. He was complicated, violent and protective, ruthless and tender, a man built from contradictions who was trying desperately to give his son something better than he'd received. On the 3rd Friday, Dante asked Carmen to come earlier than usual. "Just you and me," he'd said. "Before Nico gets home from school, I want to discuss something." So Carmen found herself in the private kitchen at 4 in the afternoon. Her stomach knotted with anxiety about what this private meeting might mean. Dante was already there, wearing jeans and a black Henley, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. "Thank you for coming early." He gestured to the island where he'd set out wine and appetizers. "I wanted to talk without Nico present." "Is something wrong?" Carmen sat, accepting the wine glass he offered. "Has he had another incident I don't know about?" "No. The opposite, actually." Dante leaned against the counter across from her. "He's doing remarkably well. His therapist reports real progress. His teachers say he's like a different student. And when I ask him what changed, he says it's because someone finally speaks his mother's language." "That's good. That's what we wanted, right?" "It is. But there's a complication." Dante's expression was carefully neutral. "Your 1-month trial period ends next week. We need to discuss whether you're continuing this arrangement, and if so, what that looks like long-term." Carmen had been deliberately not thinking about the end of the trial period, operating in the comfortable present where she helped Nico and collected her generous paycheck and ignored the growing complications of her feelings toward both the Bellini men. But reality couldn't be avoided forever. "What do you want?" she asked carefully. "I want you to continue. Permanently. Not just as an emergency contact, but as a real presence in Nico's life. Weekly dinners, help with his Italian studies, someone he can talk to when grief gets too heavy." Dante set down his own wine glass. "But I need to know you're committed, that you're not going to walk away when things get difficult or dangerous." "Dangerous how?" Dante was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing how much to tell her. "My world is stabilizing, but it's not stable. There are still people who'd hurt Nico to get to me. People who might decide you're valuable enough as leverage to target. If you're going to be permanently part of Nico's life, you need to understand the risks." Ice slid through Carmen's veins. "You're saying I could be in danger just from helping your son?" "Yes. It's unlikely. I have excellent security, and most of my enemies know that targeting children or civilians brings consequences they can't afford. But unlikely isn't impossible." His dark eyes held hers. "I won't lie to you about the reality of associating with my family. There's always risk. Always the chance that violence from my world spills over into yours." Carmen thought about walking away, about returning to her safe, invisible life-serving cafeteria food, and staying below everyone's radar. But she also thought about Nico's face when they cooked his mother's recipes, about the way he'd started to heal, about how she'd finally found purpose in something beyond just surviving. "What kind of security are we talking about?" she asked. "Vincent would be assigned to you. Discreet protection, nothing obvious enough to disrupt your normal life, but present enough to deter anyone stupid enough to try something." Dante pulled out another folder. "I've also prepared an addendum to your contract. Increased compensation to account for the risk. Life insurance policy. Legal protection if anything happens. You'd be as protected as anyone in my inner circle." Carmen opened the folder, her eyes widening at the numbers. The salary increase alone was staggering, but the life insurance policy was worth more than she'd earn in 10 years at the cafeteria. "This is too much," she breathed. "It's exactly enough. You're taking on risk that civilians shouldn't have to carry. You should be compensated accordingly." Dante moved around the island to stand beside her. "But beyond the money, beyond the security, I need to know. Are you willing to be part of Nico's life permanently? To be someone he can depend on, not just for a month or a year, but for as long as he needs you?" The question carried weight beyond simple employment. This was about family, about belonging, about choosing to entangle herself with the Bellinis in ways that would permanently change her life. "I need honesty from you," Carmen said, looking up at him. "Complete honesty. Are you offering me this position purely because I'm good for Nico? Or is there something else?" Dante's expression shifted, the careful control cracking slightly. You're asking if my feelings are purely paternal concern for my son's well-being. Yes. Then no, they're not. The admission hung in the air between them. You're good for Nico, and that's the primary reason for this offer. But I'd be lying if I said I haven't come to value your presence for my own reasons. The way you challenge me, the way you see past the reputation to who I actually am, the way you make me remember what it felt like to have genuine conversations with someone who isn't afraid of me or trying to use me. Carmen's heart hammered against her ribs. That's not exactly professional. No, it's not. Which is why I'm being honest about it rather than pretending. Dante's voice was low, intense. If you accept this position, I'll maintain appropriate boundaries. I won't pressure you into anything beyond helping Nico. But I also won't insult your intelligence by pretending I don't feel drawn to you in ways that go beyond professional admiration. That makes things complicated. Everything about my life is complicated, but some complications are worth it. He held her gaze. So I'm asking, are you willing to accept this position knowing that there's attraction here? That I respect you enough to be honest about it, but that I'll never let it compromise Nico's well-being or put you in an uncomfortable position? Carmen should say no, should thank him for his honesty and walk away before she got any deeper into this dangerous, complicated situation. But looking at this man who'd been so carefully controlled and guarded, who was offering her honesty and vulnerability despite how much it cost him, she couldn't force the words out. I accept, she heard herself say, with conditions. Name them. Nico comes first, always. If anything between us starts to compromise his healing or our ability to work together for his benefit, we stop it immediately. Carmen held up a finger. Second, I maintain my job at Riverside. I'm not willing to be completely financially dependent on you, regardless of the salary you're offering. Third, if I ever feel unsafe, or if the danger becomes too much, I can walk away. No retaliation, no consequences beyond losing the position. Agreed. All of it. Dante extended his hand. Welcome to the family, Carmen DeLuca. She shook his hand, feeling the warmth of his palm, the calluses that told stories she'd never fully know. This was insane. This was probably the worst decision she'd ever made. But looking at Dante Bellini, this complicated, dangerous man who was trying so hard to be a good father, despite everything working against him, Carmen couldn't bring herself to regret it. I should warn you, Dante said, still holding her hand. Nico is going to be thrilled. He's been worried all week that you'd leave when the trial period ended. He said that? Every night before bed. What if Carmen doesn't want to stay? What if she gets scared of us and leaves like everyone else? Dante's thumb brushed across her knuckles, the gesture unconscious and intimate. You've become important to him. Essential even. Please don't make me regret trusting you with that. I won't. Carmen squeezed his hand once before pulling away, needing distance to think clearly. When does the new contract start? Monday, if you'll sign tonight. He produced the final document from yet another folder. Take your time reading it. I'll make coffee. Carmen read through the contract carefully while Dante moved around the kitchen with comfortable familiarity. The terms were generous almost to the point of absurdity. The salary, the benefits, the protections. But the responsibilities were also clear. Weekly dinners, availability during Nico's incidents, help with Italian studies and cultural connection, presence at important family events. She was signing on to be part of this family, not just an employee or a consultant, but someone woven into the fabric of their daily lives. It's a big decision, Dante said, setting a coffee cup beside her. I won't pressure you to sign tonight if you need more time. No, I'll sign. Carmen pulled out a pen, her hand steady as she wrote her name on the signature line. But I need you to promise me something. What? That if this gets too complicated, if attraction turns into something that compromises our work with Nico, you'll be honest about it. that we won't pretend everything is professional while secretly wanting more. She looked up at him. I can't do the thing where we dance around feelings and pretend they don't exist. If we're going to do this, we need to be honest, even when it's uncomfortable. Dante took the signed contract, setting it aside. Then he pulled out a chair and sat beside her, close enough that their knees almost touched. I promise complete honesty, even when it's difficult, even when it makes things complicated. He paused. Can I be honest about something right now? Yes. Sitting here with you, watching you care about my son, seeing you fit so naturally into our lives, it makes me want things I thought died with Maria. Connection, partnership, someone who understands both sides of who I am. His voice was low, careful. But I also know that timing matters, that we're in the middle of helping Nico heal, and that has to be the priority. So I'm not asking for anything beyond what we already have. I'm just being honest that the want is there. Carmen's breath caught. I appreciate the honesty. But nothing. Just thank you for being direct, for not playing games or hiding behind professional boundaries while actually wanting more. She managed a smile. Though I should probably admit that the wanting isn't entirely one-sided. Dante's eyes darkened. No? No. Which is terrifying and ill-advised and probably going to make everything more complicated. Carmen stood, needing movement to deal with the intensity of the moment. But I'm choosing to be here anyway, to help Nico and be part of your lives, and figure out the rest as we go. They stood there in the quiet kitchen, coffee growing cold on the counter, both acutely aware they'd just crossed some threshold into territory neither had fully mapped. The attraction was acknowledged now, named and real, hanging between them like a promise and a threat. Then footsteps on the stairs broke the moment. Nico burst into the kitchen, his backpack sliding off his shoulder, his face lighting up when he saw Carmen. You're here early. Are we cooking tonight? Can we try making Mama's tiramisu? I found the recipe and it looks complicated, but... He stopped, looking between them. What's wrong? Why do you both look weird? Nothing's wrong, Dante assured him. Actually, something's very right. Carmen has agreed to continue working with us permanently. Nico's expression transformed from confusion to pure joy. Really? You're staying? Like, not just for another month, but actually staying? Actually staying, Carmen confirmed, and found herself swept into a hug that knocked the breath out of her. Thank you, Nico whispered against her shoulder. Thank you for not leaving like everyone else. Carmen hugged him back, this tall, fragile boy who'd been through too much too young, and felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness, of purpose, of finally being in the place she was supposed to be. Yes, it was complicated. Yes, it was dangerous. Yes, she was probably going to get her heart broken or worse. But looking at Nico's face, at the relief and joy and hope shining there, and feeling Dante's gaze on them both, protective and grateful and full of complicated feelings neither of them could fully acknowledge yet, Carmen knew she'd made the right choice. This was where she belonged, with this broken, healing family, speaking the language of grief and hope, and Italian phrases that connected the living to the dead. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.